Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Helium and why it seems like it might have especially high upside potential relative to some of the other assets that we're following. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So if you're not familiar with Helium as a project, it's basically a decentralized data provider. So essentially it's wireless data. People operate hotspots and then they earn HNT tokens in return for running those hotspots. Then people who want to use the Helium network need HNT tokens and a derivative of HNT tokens to actually then use that data. So think of it like a decentralized Verizon, for example, or a decentralized AT&T's decentralized cell data provider type of deal. So that's what Helium is trying to build, a decentralized version of some of those centralized companies that offer wireless data. And so if you look at the price history of HNT, that's what I'm showing you here, color-coded based on our risk indicator, you just see how well HNT has performed over its life. It's had a lot more up than it has had down. And then, of course, the color coding here is based on our risk indicator, the upside downside potential indicator. This is a machine learning based model we have here at the channel that quantifies risk. So higher scores mean higher risk, lower scores mean lower risk. And you can see the UDPI does a good job of identifying these low risk zones where accumulating HNT historically has been advantageous, as well as these high risk zones where distributing HNT has been advantageous. And one of the things that kind of stands out about HNT right now is that it's actually at quite a bit of a lower level than a lot of other assets right now. I'm showing you here the medium-term UDPI. This is reactive to moves. They play out over weeks to months. And the medium-term UDPI, as well, I'll show you in a minute, as well as the long-term, which cares about moves that play out over months, as well as the short-term, which cares about moves that play over days to weeks. It's pretty low compared to other assets that we're monitoring, right? The medium-term UDPI is sitting just above -3. So quite a bit more upside than downside potential that the model thinks is realistic in kind of the more medium-term time frame. And we can see that this has done a good job of identifying these kind of high risk zones in the past where distributing HNT has been effective. We're nowhere near those levels now, right? We're down in more of the territory where in the past accumulation of HNT has been advantageous. We're not in these high risk zones at this point. One of the ways that we can think about this is that, while the rest of the market has been rallying, HNT has been rallying as well, but maybe it hasn't moved as much. And so if the market remains bullish, Bitcoin remains bullish, if we don't get a big correction in the stock market or things like that, it could be that HNT is just waiting to put in its move. So it hasn't put in its move yet, but maybe it will. And that's kind of what this is reflecting, that this is an outlier from a risk perspective, that HNT is sitting at notably lower risk than a lot of the other crypto assets. We actually put out a tweet about this recently, noting that kind of difference. And if we just look across the different time frames, this shows up. A lot of the other assets we're watching are kind of much more in the neutral territory across these different indicators, or actually up into these higher risk zones. HNT kind of stands apart. It's at -3.37 on the long-term UDPI, quite low. I believe this is the lowest long-term UDPI that we have currently, or one of the lowest, if not the lowest on the long-term UDPI. And a similar story in the medium term and the short term. It's one of the lowest that we're monitoring right now on these levels, suggesting that across these different time frames, the model thinks that there's more realistic upside than downside potential. And again, this stands out from the group. So if the market remains bullish, obviously that's a big if, but if the market were to continue to go into an uptrend, it could be that HNT is just biding its time, that it will then put in a big move to the upside and maybe outperform a number of other assets that have already put in their moves during those time periods. So that's just one thing from this risk perspective that I think is notable about HNT. Now, obviously, nothing's guaranteed. If broader market conditions don't allow it, I don't think HNT will just run on its own. I think we have to maintain this broader bullish sentiment. But if we do, I'm looking at HNT as potentially being one that could perform quite well coming up, especially relative to some of these other assets that have already put in some moves to the upside. So that's a risk-based perspective on why HNT seems to be offering maybe especially high upside potential relative to some other assets. There's other factors that we can consider when we think about HNT. And we can think of just kind of other things that are going on in the space and what's going on. So one thing that's important to keep in mind is that Helium as a network is attracting a lot of capital, a lot of investment. in this case, probably more along the lines of VC money coming in here, raising $200 million in fresh capital. The company's changing their names, but the network will remain calling Helium. But this suggests that there is interest in the project, right? There is outside money that's interested in getting in, presumably because they think that there's potential in Helium to realize a lot of upside if they get in at this point. So that's an interesting thing to note. And another thing that we can look at is just the network itself and how it's been performing or how it's been behaving, especially in terms of growth. So here I'm just on the Helium Explorer, which has this great interactive map where you can actually see the Helium coverage across the globe. And see the main kind of hotspots are the United States, China, and Europe, which would be probably more or less expected. China, and then also some of Southern Asia as well. And so I'm just going to focus in on the US because here we can have some comparisons to more centralized ones that I'll show in a minute. But you can see it's starting to kind of permeate, but it is still splotchy, right? It's not like you're going to get perfect coverage with Helium. If you're in most of the kind of more urbanized areas in the United States, it seems like there you're probably going to have decent coverage. That's where these splotches, if you zoom in, tend to kind of coincide around major city centers, for example. So it's certainly growing, and one of the things you can see is that there's currently, over 700,000 hotspots, and that's grown at a rate of 77,000 in the last month. That's a pretty quick rate of growth, right? To go from basically all the way back here at around 630,000 all the way over 700,000 in just 1 month. That's a good amount of great growth. You'd like to see that continue because, again, with any kind of network, more value comes in the larger the network is. And I would say that's especially the case for something like Helium, where if it can start getting better coverage across the United States, for example, or other countries, it might be able to start putting in better competition against some of these centralized companies that currently dominate those markets. So we can look at Verizon's network, for example, and see that they have very strong coverage over most of the United States. So obviously this is their official map, so this is probably the best case scenario, but it's probably pretty close, right? That Verizon has very high amount of coverage. And we can see that also with T-Mobile. Again, pretty solid coverage across the United States with just some splotches that are missing. And then also AT&T is also very well covering basically all of North America, or where a lot of the population is in North America. And so kind of my perspective on this is that I think Helium definitely seems to be onto a good start with this, but I think there's no question that Helium is still in its young days. And I think really for Helium to be able to start supplanting these centralized competitors that are massive and have a lot of market share, and then also just frankly a lot of capital to put into growth of their network, things like that. Obviously, HNT has a ways to go, but I think that the way that HNT could start competing with those competitors would be that if it can get better coverage, and especially if it can be a lot cheaper than these other networks, that would be something that might really set it apart. So if you start seeing this continue to grow at a really quick rate, see this start to fill up more, and if it ends up being the case that using Helium to get data ends up being a lot cheaper than using these centralized alternatives, that could be what could drive people to it. Because I think on its own, decentralization probably isn't going to be a strong enough argument for people to switch. If it's the same price, people are just going to stay with the one that has better coverage. But if suddenly Helium is a lot cheaper, and especially if it gets more competitive with its coverage, in my opinion, that might be where you'd see it start to take off a little bit more from that perspective. If you think that the market potential of HNT is to start stealing customers from those centralized alternatives. Obviously, if you have a different thesis on Helium, this doesn't apply. But that's kind of my current evaluation of it, is I think they're kind of competing in this space in a decentralized way with obviously the hope would be that this would be ultimately a cheaper and better network than those alternatives, which would bring people away. So I still think that Helium has a long way to go before potentially being able to realize that. So it's something you'd have to watch. I think we're still early days, and so there's obviously inherent risk about whether or not Helium will ever be able to achieve those goals. But it is an interesting project, and it's one that has a very clear real-world use case, and it's kind of separated from the crypto space in that sense, that this is the kind of thing that anybody could be interested in, not just people who are interested in crypto. So that's where I think Helium has some interesting kind of potential there. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about in this video was just to wrap up by talking about some of the different drawdowns we've seen in Helium And just note kind of how extreme this current drawdown is that we've seen from the all-time highs back in November to the bottom that we saw here in January. Because you'll note that there's really only one other time in Helium's past where it's corrected more precipitously, and that was really back in the very early days, which frankly would be expected. The market cap of HNT was way lower back here. Lower market cap assets tend to have higher volatility, so this was about an 83% drop down from the top of this wick, which in some ways could also be kind of an unfair thing, because that price probably didn't spend a lot of time up there, probably a bit anomalous. You might think that this is a more fair place to kind of put it, more around 72% drawdown. 60% drawdown here, coming off of the big run up into April and May. It's actually notable that HNT had a very mild bear market, if you can call it that, in the summer relative to a lot of other assets. That's one thing that kind of sets it apart as well. And then also we had this big run up in August. We had about a 40% drawdown into September. And then the biggest one more recently, the 66% drawdown. And again, this was happening when HNT had quite a high market capitalization, so it is notable just because, again, as market cap goes up, volatility tends to decrease. So what does that mean? Well, one thing that it might mean in some ways is that this is pretty notable that we've drawn down this far. It's a pretty extreme move. And so maybe it's reasonable to think that this could be a bottom, right? That for HNT to keep on dumping down further, it would really be having to take out some of this precedent and really go back to these times where it's a much smaller market cap. I would actually view this to be a pretty extreme move if we started moving down into some of these levels here. And it seems like we've been able to turn this kind of $20 range as a pretty strong support so far recently. I have to see if that holds up. But this is where I think if broader market conditions can remain bullish, then HNT might be able to start realizing some of that upside potential. You know, we went in, put in a higher high relative to here. We might be able to put in a higher low at around here. And you'd like to see it continue to start moving back up. And then if the broader market remains bullish, maybe we can go back up and start revisiting some of these higher price levels. And then who knows, if things go well enough, maybe we can go off to break into new all-time highs. But again, given the fact that HNT hasn't moved super crazy off of the bottom here, only up about 15%, whereas some other assets have been up over 100% from the bottoms they put in January or February, I do think that there could, and especially in confluence with what our risk indicator is thinking about HNT, it does seem like there's a lot of upside potential that could be realized should market conditions allow it. So HNT is certainly going to be one that's on my radar. So not financial advice, you should make your own decisions. These are just some things that I'm thinking about with HNT. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. And remember, with UDPI, we're all going to make it.